So I'll start off with a very short, we only have half an hour for this appendix. This is the shortest appendix, Appendix G, on peripheral canal design and implementation options. One of the things that I think has distressed our authors, certainly has distressed me in the conversations about a peripheral canal, is this idea that, oh, once you decide a peripheral canal, then we're done. and you know, I thought that we should prepare something relatively formal to disabuse people of this notion. That once you decide to make, well, maybe that's one reason why we have trouble making strategic decisions, because once you make a strategic decision, then you have a whole bunch more things you have to decide. But given that we're going to be forced to make a strategic decision, just by the way the lay of the land is changing, we ought to address these, and we ought to go in with our eyes a bit open, and hopefully we're organized for the task. So for this talk, I thought probably the cover slide ought to include this idea. Oh, here, peripheral canal. What does that mean? Well, here's about 4 or 5 different alignments for a peripheral canal, all of which take water out of the Sacramento River and put it down to the Clifton Court forebay, or where the current intakes are. So this illustrates, I think, just one aspect of what you have to decide after you decide to have a peripheral canal is where do you want to put it? What alignment are you going to take? And that'll certainly have implications for cost, environmental impact, all kinds of things. Head losses, whatever, capital, all kinds of stuff, operating costs. There's a lot of different alignments. So what does a PC mean? What does PC mean? Peripheral canal, politically correct, I don't know, all kinds of things. Personal computer. What a PC means depends on how it's implemented. You can implement it in all kinds of different ways. It'll have a lot of different environmental impacts, cost impacts, water supply impacts, water quality impacts, depending upon how you implement it. And you should design a peripheral canal, just as I would maintain as an engineer, you should design anything based on your objectives. Okay, so you shouldn't already have a design in mind before you lay out your objectives. You should say, okay, PC, if I were going to have a PC, what would be its objectives? And then I'll design it for those objectives. It's sort of opposite of how we often do things, and sometimes sometimes different than how we do things even in our personal lives, but I think our personal lives are often a whole lot better, as well as many of our decisions, if we make our decisions based on the objectives. So these are just design decisions based on the objectives. There are certainly many decisions that are required, and each of you should have now passed out Table 1 from Appendix G, and those that are on the web should be able to look this up from the PPIC appendix. Appendix G has Table 1 in it. And you'll see, what easily are several dozen decisions in a broad classification, but I think when you get down to the detailed levels of design and implementation, there are probably several hundred, maybe even several thousand detailed implementation decisions that are important for your objectives for a peripheral canal. If we think we have trouble making a strategic decision for the delta, choosing those 4 export strategies, among those 4 export strategies, so to speak, we will have to have a still more decision-capable set of institutions to accomplish the implementation decisions for such a device. So I think this appendix also is meant to pose some challenges to those that are thinking about institutions for implementing such a thing. I think as a sort of a casual student of engineering history, it's often, when you look at major water resource projects, major engineering projects, the organization of the institutions that implement them is really important. And you have to have a very clear idea when you organize the institutions what you want to accomplish. And you will design the institutions and the finance and everything else differently depending upon what you want to do. So to me, if you're going to go through a major governance look at the delta, the way you set up the governance is to make some particular decisions. Those might be strategic decisions, or those might be implementation decisions, and they might be different institutions that you want for those very different kinds of purposes. So, peripheral canal objectives. So let's sort of take a casual step through this a little bit. And I emphasize that this is casual. This is sort of Jay's few evenings and a few weekends sort of looking at this stuff. Objectives: reduce the take of desirable species. Improve in-delta flows for ecosystem purposes. So not only just not sucking them out, but not disturbing the flows that affect where those fish go. Improve water quality for urban and agricultural users. Improve long-term sustainability of delta exports, with sea level rise and more open water in the delta. Reduce the entanglement of water supply and environmental management in the delta, so you can hopefully improve the amount of flexibility you have for the two different objectives. Improve the delta region in terms of recreation opportunities in the local in-delta economy, something that hasn't been talked about very much, but I think if you're going to build a peripheral canal and acquire all those rights of way and all those kinds of things, is something you might want to give some attention to. Minimize the financial costs of facility construction and operations, sort of a normal garden variety kind of objective. And this is not to say this is all the objectives. When I list these up, even these up, I think, gosh, that's an awful lot for a few people to work on. So governance, again, becomes quite important on how to sort and balance these objectives. There are a whole bunch of different implementation decisions, and I think the table you have is somewhat organized in terms of trying to classify these different implementation decisions in groups. So infrastructure design options, capacities. Do you have pumps? Do you have fish screens? Sort of infrastructure, capital-intensive decisions like that you make once and then it's hard to change. Operating policy decisions, which physically you make them once and you should be able to change them over time, particularly if you've designed the infrastructure to be flexible. But sometimes with operating policies, we have Corps of Engineers policies on operating dams for flood control that haven't changed since the 1950s, even though our understanding of flood control and our understanding of and the development of flood damage potential downstream has changed quite a lot. So in principle, physically in an engineering sense, it should be easy to change policy options, operating policy options as we move along, but sometimes our institutions have not been set up to allow that to occur easily. Environmental management, there's all kinds of different environmental management activities in terms of land acquisition, what to do with delta land use in Sassoon Marsh, local in delta flows that you might regulate with barriers or non-barriers or channel configurations or whatever. A whole bunch of those kinds of decisions, some of which are sort of almost permanent decisions and some of which are operating decisions. Issues of ownership, governance, regulatory, and finance options. Some of these Ellen will talk about when she talks about Appendix A next. And sort of accompanying delta land and water management. So how do you manage the lands in and around the rights of way? All kinds of things there. I think I have a list coming up next. And then major adjustments and mitigations. So I apologize, this presentation is excessively listy, but that's just the nature of this appendix. I'll just plow through them. You can read it at your leisure. So just examples of infrastructure decisions: intake locations, capacities, outlet locations, rights of way. Is the canal going to be lined or unlined? Is it going to be a canal or a pipeline? Fish screens, what type? Are you going to have fish salvage facilities or whatever? Use of pumps, all those kinds of things. Ancillary storage. Do you want to have a big intake with a little bit of storage so that you can take gulps at different times of the tidal cycle without having to expand conveyance further downstream? And how do you coordinate all of this with the other projects that are going on in the Delta? Lots of stuff here. Operating policies. Well, often you think, most people think about operating policies, we're just going to have a constant intake and we're not going to vary it with time. It's just going to be a constant straw with a constant sucking sound going on. Well, that's not really how we operate even today. Are we going to have a sort of a seasonally varying intake operation? Are we going to make it opportunistic, where we say, we're going to allow you to take all you want in these kind of windows and less in these kind of windows and nothing at all at these kind of windows? And so we'll have some kind of an opportunistic conditions for intake operations. If you have multiple intakes, you have to decide, when to take how much from which intake. Certainly for the dual facility, you can look at the dual facility as sort of a PC with two intakes. Just one that happens to be at the very downstream end. You have to decide, one am I going to take from this intake and one from that, and how often am I going to screw up and take, I think the fish are over here, but I use this intake and I get them at the wrong time. Am I smart enough? Can I be smart enough? Is my monitoring good enough to catch those things and operate it well? Coordinated intake and outlet operations. So there's some options for a peripheral canal where you would take water in and dump it in the lower San Joaquin River to try to clean out perhaps the Stockton Ship Channel or something like that at times. So you might want to coordinate the intake and outlet operations that way. My favorite. Paul Hutton's here. He's heard this idea too many times from me. Batch flow operations. When you take if you have a dual intakes, one of which is high quality Sacramento River water, one of which might be lousy quality Delta water, maybe you want to say, okay, I have a window of opportunity here to take good quality water out of the Sacramento River. I'm going to take it, I'm going to keep it all on that pipeline. I'm going to send it directly to the urban users that value that high quality the most. And then when that high quality water is no longer available, for some fish migration reason I have to shut off Sacramento River, I'm going to take water from the in-delta intake, and that's lousy water. It has all these treatment costs that the urban guys don't want to avoid. I'm going to keep that segregated in the canal, and I'm only going to send it to agricultural users who don't mind that so much. Well, they might mind the salts. But anyway, you can see this idea of batch operations. We do that quite commonly, actually, with refined petroleum products. We have one set of pipelines, and for a while they'll run diesel fuel, for a while they'll run gasoline, things like that. And then we have all kinds of constrained intake and outlet policies that you can work into an operating policy. I want to give you a sense with this slide that there's probably several hundred dimensions of decision space just in this one class of implementation decisions, and that some of those implementation decisions you would want to set and experiment with over time, and some you would want to be very flexible and sort of fly by the seat of your pants, have a lot of flexibility to take advantage of opportunities. Environmental management, these would include a whole bunch of different things that you might do to try to reduce the take at current in-delta diversion locations, things you might do to reduce confusing in-delta flow patterns or fish migration, things you might do in terms of operations to improve the flood and ebb tidal flows in different channels within the delta for different desirable delta species. Things that you might do to reduce the loss of in-delta nutrients from exports. Well, I don't know, whatever this stuff is. I'm making this up because I'm not a biologist. But I'm sure biologists here can make up a list at least as interesting as my list. Improve overall delta food web, whatever that means. And reduce the interference of water supply with delta environmental management. So there's a whole class of things that I'm sure we could easily fill several pages with here. So here's the second page of my blathering on this subject. Some potential problems with a peripheral canal that I think have some aspects of environmental management. The increased potential take, at least, from the Sacramento River and the North Delta. Bill had a 10,000 CFS flow past the PC intake that he required in our modeling to try to minimize or avoid reverse flows up on the Sacramento River intake at flood tides. This would be things along those lines. PC will certainly create less freshwater inflows into the delta because you'll be essentially converting a delta diversion into an upstream diversion. We have a lot of those already. There'll be certainly less potential for some less flushing of any contaminants that come through. You'll be sending it down to LA or wherever. And some reduced dilution of contaminants. So I think sort of the bottom line for me, at least at this point, regarding environmental management is your PC design and your operations really have to accompany some initial design for a delta ecosystem. That's I think a false division we've maintained for a very long time is PC design and how we're going to manage the environment. You really have to. You're going to need, I think, to have these come together not only from a practical perspective, in terms of implementation decisions, but also from a political perspective and legal perspective, I imagine. Ownership, regulatory, and finance options, yes, all of those. Ellen's going to talk about those, or some of them maybe. We won't finish that conversation, but we'll get it started. Accompanying land and water management in the delta, sort of the aquatic and terrestrial habitat in and around the Peripheral Canal and remaining levees, flood management aspects, the levees themselves. Are you going to allow trees to grow on them? Things like that. Big issues like that, oddly enough. What does this do to delta agriculture? There'll be some locations where you will have reduced the water quality for some of the remaining in-delta agricultural locations, I think particularly the South Delta, perhaps. Is there anything you can do about that, or what can you do about that? What would you want to do about that? Recreation, again, go along with this. Anadromous fish passage up and down. Are there changes you would want to make to the delta to accompany a PC? Now that you're not managing the delta for water supply operations, that would improve it for fish purposes. And I include other here because I'm sure there are a lot of other things. Major adjustments and mitigations, people that could be hurt. People would be hurt. People that will say they're hurt about all these things. Certainly there are delta farmers. Some of the delta farmers will have sunk costs. Some will have real costs that are not sunk. They were relying on getting fresher water from the Sacramento River even though they lived in the South Delta, and now you have a peripheral canal, they're going to get less of it. Should you compensate them at all? How much? Those kinds of things. Some of the delta farmers whose land is going to go under anyway, are there things you can do to make their existence easier and that transition easier? Contra Costa Water District, they currently take water out of the delta. My feeling is that, gosh, it's an easy decision to say that you need to connect them up to a peripheral canal if you're going to have a peripheral canal. But you'll have all kinds of negotiations over, okay, where's the connection going to be? How big is it going to be? Who's going to pay how much for it? All that kind of stuff. The North Bay Aqueduct. The North Bay Aqueduct has terrible water quality, just with TOCs, not so much bromides. They've been having this problem for a while. They have some studies that indicate about a $150 million cost, something on that order, to move their intake to the Sacramento River. We heard Bill and Peter say yesterday that one of the good things you could do for fish is to move that North Bay Aqueduct intake over to the Sacramento River. This seems like a good thing to do, but I know that there's going to be a bunch of details about cost allocations and rights of way and everything like that, fish screens and all that stuff if you move it. The Delta towns, Isleton and all those guys, Walnut Grove, different things there. Recreation, the different kinds of fishing that you'll see in this new delta and the different kinds of fishing you will see with the Peripheral Canal. Other things. And then, so it's not just a list of decisions, make it look daunting, which it is. But how are we going to make all these decisions? How could we make all these decisions? These implementation decisions, I think, are harder than the initial decision to employ peripheral canal as part of a strategic solution. I don't think we're prepared to make the strategic decision, and I don't think right now we're certainly not prepared to make implementation decisions. If we took, even if we were able to make the implementation decisions at 1/10 the time it's currently taking us to make a strategic decision, we have no hope of completing anything before it all collapses. So, just put it in perspective a little bit. I think this is going to be required to make a strategic decision first, and then along with a process for the implementation decisions. I think if you wait to say, okay, we're not going to make a strategic decision until we know all of what the implementation decisions would be. I mean, first of all, I think that would just be foolish because you will spend a lot of money maybe for a decision you're not going to make. And I think my impression is from the analysis that we presented in Appendix J is that we should be prepared now in terms of an ability to make some of these strategic decisions. And that more information is not going to be particularly helpful in improving that ability to make a strategic decision. Implementation process will be more important than the strategic decision. I put a question mark there because I'm not sure that's the case, but I think it's quite likely. I go back to the fish slide that we had for the probabilities of fish viability that we got from the survey of the biologist and how big that range was. It's quite often that range within a single strategy for delta exports was bigger than the differences between different strategies. So again, implementation is going to be important, maybe more important than the strategic decision. Although some people will use that as an excuse to make no decision and say, well, let's tinker with what we've got. I think that's probably not a wise choice. The numbers never get high with that. To me, this is going to require central state authority. I don't see the federal government coming in and helping us make strategic decisions on our territory. There'll certainly be a stakeholder role required, but the way the stakeholders seem to have been handling this problem is like trying to untie a knot by having everybody pull really hard on their end. I think it's in many ways just made the knot tighter at times. So I think state authority is going to have to come in and sort of cut that knot at some point, and they'll have to decide. That's really the relevant authority level to make these kind of decisions when the local interests have disagreements. Implementation decisions will require revision for decades after construction. Again, we're moving into a very different delta. No matter what strategy we choose, we should not set up decisions so that they're impossible to change. That's probably setting us up for not performing very well in the long term. We'll find opportunities we're not able to take advantage of easily, and we'll find problems we're not able to fix very easily. So before construction, here's a list of things to do before construction. Governing institutions and finance arrangements. Before construction, after you've decided to make a PC, institution for designing facilities and operation, design an institution, build an institution for in-delta habitat and environment, funding for environmental management in the delta, institution for coordinating land and water management in the delta, mechanisms for resolving disputes expeditiously, something we have not been particularly good at, and the funded independent science and technical capability. I say that without an ounce of self-service. But I think as a pragmatic matter, you want something to work, you got to figure out what makes work. And a suite of performance measures that are explicitly linked to project goals and objectives. And by a suite, I don't mean 462. I think if you have 462 performance measures, you're not going to know whether you're doing anything at all. But pick a few things. Pick the most important things, only a few of them. After construction, you're going to have sort of focused monitoring studies no matter what. You'll want to do this for all kinds of reasons. You'll want to continue having operational studies. You want to look for opportunities and problems and ideas on how to fix them or take advantage of the opportunities. All sorts of environmental management activities that you can now do once you disentangle water supply and environmental management a bit. Some oversight and auditing of governing institutions and finance, not just financial accounting, which we seem to over-excel at times, but also functional performance. Institutional mechanisms for adjusting operations and policies. I'm not using the word adaptive management because I think in the past all we've been able to do is spell that right. And a funded effort to improve environmental management in the Delta. So conclusions, just to make it brief and try to stay within time here. Making a decision on a peripheral canal is tough. Making needed implementation decisions is tougher. If governing and finance arrangements are weak, neither of these will happen. You'll not have a strategic decision made, and you won't have implementation done. If beneficiary financial support is weak, neither will happen. I don't see enough money in the state. The state has negative money. The federal system has negative money. I don't see a lot of money coming out of that to fund either the infrastructure portions, the operations portions, or the environmental portions of the new Delta. You might expect a few $1 million here and there, but not billions that are really needed. So, if you want to have a peripheral canal, you got to step up to the plate with a wad of cash. The alternative is to support or substantially reduce Delta exports with little environmental funding. So if you don't want to have a peripheral canal, then you're not going to have beneficiaries around to pay for either the infrastructure or the environmental side of things. And there'll be probably less political support statewide for the environmental side of things. You won't have exports eventually, but you might not have any funding for the other environmental things you want. So that's that. Any questions? Just in case you thought it was easy after Appendix J.
So I like the way you've laid this out with, making it clear that there are lots of different steps in this decision, but it starts, as this appendix does, with the goals and objectives. And I have to say that I know that I think that's one of the toughest things. And unless we do that first, in a slightly more sophisticated way than your appendix does, then I find it difficult to see how we actually take the subsequent steps that you've outlined. If we have objectives that are as general as improving water quality or improving Delta region recreation, these are very difficult objectives to actually design a facility around. How would you recommend that we, the larger California we, go about really honing in on those goals and objectives so that we can go through those subsequent design and operational decisions that you've outlined?
I guess my own personal feeling is if you have more than 5 of them, you're not going to be able to make it work.
I guess my comment is not so much on how many there are, but on the kind of lack of specificity of them. And frankly, improve is not a very it's not really an objective. It begs,
I don't know. I think it is an objective, but how you measure it becomes problematic. I guess I would start off with the number of objectives. You better have not too many, because you have to balance. A lot of this involves balancing among objectives. And if you have too many objectives in your head just explodes and you can't think about it. You can't think about trade-offs when you have too many trade-offs in your head. So the first criteria to me is keep the number small. You can see how we try to keep the number of objectives very small in our strategic analysis. I would like to have had a third objective on there with the in-delta economy, and we had this rationalization, perhaps I think real for the most part, that you didn't need to consider the in-delta economy as part of this particular strategic decision. But for the in-delta economy, that will be very important on the implementation decisions. You won't be able to, so I think you have to have at least those 3 objectives: ecosystem, statewide economics, and in-delta economy. If you wanted to bear it down to 3 things, that's what I would do it. And I think you can measure those 3 things as we have. The in-delta economies, I think, also can be reduced to some estimates. It's got to be harder than that, but I think that's the extreme you could do in simplification. So I don't have an answer for your question, but we have some time to think about it.
Well, let me say, is that level of objective that you've? And I know the analysis that you've done is not designed to move towards implementation. It's designed to move towards the initial strategic decision. Right. But in order to go through with design and implementation and operation, do you not agree that there has to be a more sophisticated articulation of those objectives?
I think there has to be a bound on the sophistication of those objectives. In that if you have too sophisticated a specification of objectives, as in huge numbers of them, finely detailed, then I think it becomes harder to work with them.
I agree. I'm not. The number is not the issue. Frankly, I find that very, very generalized objectives make it very, easy to come up with these broad strategic things, and then
I'm
get
not
you
disagreeing
nowhere
with you
when
in
you
that
come.
sense.
So, what I'm asking is how do you get to that next stage?
I think
if we are at the point of kind of being comfortable with the strategic decision, then we need to move to the next.
That
level.
needs to be a very high-level statement, and it needs to come. It essentially has to be articulated by the legislature, and the legislature in its institutions will be designing essentially how those objectives are interpreted.
So you'd
and
suggest
that's
that
going to be
the institutional step is the next step, and then that.
Right. I mean, just like we have with the federal constitution, you have a constitution that is not always going to be as specific as you would like, and so you have a particular set of institutions that interprets that for particular circumstances. And I think that's an unavoidable aspect of living in a society. You have to have some kind of institutions that implements these kinds of things. So you can't just have a straight specification of objectives in a finely refined
I think we
engineering
already
sense.
have some of those things, though, Jay. BDCP is working under constraints of the law.
Oh, did I say that BDCP hadn't accomplished all this already?
No, they haven't. They haven't. But there are in fact constraints that say in order to make this work, we have to do the following things. And you have to go towards recovery of the species if you want the permits for the water exports. That is already written in law. They are struggling with right now, and they've been struggling with for a couple of months. Well, what does that mean, and what specifically in terms of objectives they need to have in order to achieve that? I think actually that fundamental legal standard has been established in law and is something that is going to require some more specific decisions. And at least for 2 of the 3 major areas in terms of ecosystem and in terms of water supply, we're able to get there. I think there has been no real work on what do you do about Delta as a place, and how do you make that into something that's sustainable, and what kind of objectives should we have there? Yeah. All we've had in the past is kind of this general thing, well, we're going to improve the levees to 84-99 standards, and whatever happens, happens. That'll be enough, and we have to do a lot more work there.
I don't know what BDCP has done in any detail. This appendix is a distant and somewhat detached, I mean, intentionally so, a detached view of what it would take for any process, whether it's BDCP. If BDCP blows up, I still want Appendix G to be relevant. We're here for the long run. And if BDCP is doing all of it, great. But I would worry about a process that has too highly refined specifications of its objectives and has too many objectives. I think that might make it easier to negotiate an initial solution, but it might make it harder to implement and to adapt and improve as you move along. These things tend to take on a life of their own. The real ability to implement a big complex project that's new for a society or a group of people is in the governing institutions and its ability to actually work and make decisions.
I agree with you, and they're having that battle as we
And that's the real battle. Sometimes the discussion, the finite wordsmithing on objectives is just a sideshow or a distraction from making the real governance decisions. I worry a little bit about trying to set your specifications on implementation decisions so that you obey with the law as it exists now. As Alan will talk about, there's, I think, considerable evidence that the delta of the future will not be legal in today's terms. We are going to have to look at changes to the way we set up our water regulations and our water quality regulations and things like that. Perhaps even water right regulations, although I'm less sure on that. The current delta is not going to be, the future delta is not going to be legal in current terms, and we have really very little choice on the matter. Anything else? And I know it's hard for a current governmental process to say that. But I think that's probably, matter of fact, the truth.
I think it is.
So we're doomed. Oh. Okay, well, that's all. Ellen. Just in case you thought the problem was now easy. After we made a hard problem easy, we made it hard again.